everybody. I'm Miranda Sawyer, as you might have guessed. I am taking the hosting role tonight, which is very exciting for me, obviously, because of David. But I am the podcast and radio reviewer for The Observer, and I've very much enjoyed listening to The Sun King, which is the Audible Original podcast about Rupert Murdoch, which David Dimbleby presents. It's an amazing piece of work. I thoroughly recommend that you all listen to it. I'm going to do a bit of introductions. We're going to have some questions. We'll have a kind of discussion for about 35 minutes. You are very much invited to ask questions. There are it's a modern way of doing it, and I'd like to explain how we do it, okay? What you do is you get your phone, you visit Slido, which is sli.do, and you enter a code, which is called, it's hashtag Q457, and you put your questions in, okay? Then these come up, and I can ask them. This is going to be a bonus episode also for the podcast, so obviously ask great questions, you know, those kind of things. Cheer if you wish to. Laugh loads. I will now do a couple of introductions and then we'll crack on, okay? Right, over there is not David Dimbleby, but James Graham. James Graham is a playwright and also a film and television writer. He wrote a great play about ink, called Ink, about the early days of Rupert Murdoch. It was started at the Almeida and then transferred to the West End in September 2017. It went on then to transfer to the Manhattan Theatre Club on Broadway. It was nominated for 6 Tony Awards. It may well come back and tour the country. It's a great piece of work. Then in the middle, we have David Dimbleby, who you all know, but I will introduce anyway because it's polite. He is a British journalist and presenter. He is probably best known as the host of the BBC's long-running topical debate programme Question Time, and he is a fantastic narrator and presenter of The Sun King. I think they need a round of applause. Okay, we are here generally to talk about Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch, I find, most people have already got their opinions sorted about him, so perhaps we should all leave. But what I want to know is, did you change your mind about Rupert Murdoch whilst you were making work about him?
Me or him?
Both of you.
Definitely you first.
You're worried now, aren't you?
I think I didn't change my mind.
Okay.
I think I first met him in 1968 when he came as a brash young Australian who just managed to conquer Australia in newspaper terms, came to London, bought the News of the World. I did a panorama interview with him in a rather kind of stuffy way, as though he was some sort of thing that the cat had brought in. And interviewed.
We hear this on the podcast.
Well, yeah, but why are you doing this? What are you wanting? And from then on, I've not really don't think I've changed my mind, because the way I saw him then is the way I still see him, which is, I mean, maybe talk about this, which is, despite all the effects what he has on politics and people, at heart he's actually, he's a go-getting businessman who just wants to make a bomb, become an entrepreneur, and all the rest, I think, is peripheral to him. It's this driving force.
But the driving force you're saying is money.
Not money quite. Power? I mean, money, yes, but media power, yes. The power to
influence.
To influence people, but not with any particularly coherent. It's a kind of madness, a coherent way of influencing people. He doesn't have he's switched political parties. He doesn't make up his mind about who he's going to back. He called Trump a fucking idiot, and then he goes and supports him in the election. I mean, what
does he just like wins?
I think you have to go back to his father. His father was a journalist in Australia, and he made a big hit with slightly exaggerating the role of the Australians in Gallipoli in the war, and they became a hero in Australia. And I think he thought, I just want to beat him or do as well as him. And I think he loved newspapers. And I love newspapers. I mean, I prefer newspapers. I don't have a newspaper, but I prefer newspapers to radio or television. I mean, most of the news I get, I read.
Did you say you like podcasts?
Oh, podcasts, yes.
You love them too, right?
I'm his age, you know. I like the printed word, and I think he found a kind of particular excitement in the printed word, and if it made money, then that was great. You know, I didn't watch Succession until I'd finished this.
Yeah.
And when I began watching Succession, I've been watching, I'm still sort of going along trying to make out who's who. But I mean, I think that has this picture of somebody really out. I don't think Murdoch's quite like that. I think he's got a much greater sense of enjoyment about what he's doing and the mischief making. And James would probably disagree with all this, but he's got a kind of, it's the challenge. It's like being a mountaineer climbing a mountain. You know, he just wants to own everything and be everywhere. But in the media, and if you make a lot of money, I mean, he doesn't live lavishly. He's not a kind of jet setter.
Yeah.
You know, he doesn't do anything with his money except whatever he does with Jerry Hall we were hearing about, or she does with him.
Yeah. James, you're kind of nodding. So what would your analysis be? I mean, did you change your mind about him? Do you like him more?
Oh, well, just to be different from David, yes, I totally changed my mind in the work. Well, actually, no, I did. And that's because... well, I think the only reason, like, why would you put somebody who feels quite familiar in the public eye into a stage play or a film? And I think that's because you must imagine that once you see them privately, that you're going to learn something that you don't learn. And I did. I mean, I enjoyed discovering all of his many contradictions that David's mentioned some of. So I imagined based on the voice and the sound of his news outlet, broadcast and papers, that he himself personally would have that element of brash, aggressive, forthright qualities. I'm sure he does sometimes, but actually I'm also interested in the man that's socially very shy. And I watched the interview that David did when he first came in, was it 1968, for the News of the World? Mm. And this sort of unconfident, uncomfortable young man trying to make his way through the world. I found that really interesting. I find, given the very cheeky, sometimes very rude, very sleazy element of some of his tabloid papers, that he himself often is quite puritanical, and he retreats from some of that stuff. He didn't always love. The whole play was about the origins of the Sun newspaper and how they built what I think over the course of that first year of that paper changed and transformed news and Fleet Street forever, and built the model of the tabloid that we would know and love or hate today, that would eventually become Fox News and everything in America. And there were things they did in those earlier weeks. They used to do themed weeks. And they did one week that was called Pussy Week. I just thought that was really hilarious. Obviously, it was about cats and kittens, but hilariously, it's also the other thing. And Murdoch reportedly was really uncomfortable with that. It's not his natural desire to be mischievous and lewd in that way. So there's all these contradictions that you get. So I was surprised. Ultimately, the thing that surprised me the most was because of the impact and the power on politics and democracy and our culture and our news. I assumed he was more of an ideologue than he actually is, and actually I don't think he is remotely. I think he's a pragmatist and who believes in the power of the markets, and whatever sells. And
but when you say he's sort of got a puritanical, I think you're right. He's got a puritanical. I don't think he enjoyed. I mean, we in the podcast we have him saying "Hooray" for the naked page 3 girls, when his editor's saying, I think the opposite of what you put in your play, that the editor's saying in our podcast, this is the truth, because you're the playwright, we were doing reality.
Well, what is reality? They're literally going to have a fight now about page 3 girls.
What happened was that somebody produced this picture of a naked, and we actually met in the podcast we have the first model, naked page 3 girl. But anyway, Murdoch's the one who says, go for it, you know, and make it like Murdoch wanted bigger this, bigger that, and the girl as well. And but after I'd met him in '68, I had this weird invitation, which just came out of the blue, saying, would I go and have lunch with him at the Savoy Hotel? And I have the only memory I have of it is this. It was in a private room in the Savoy, and there was Rupert Murdoch, there was me, and there was a man who used to edit the Sunday Telegraph called Peregrine Worsthorne, who just been sacked from the Sunday Telegraph. And there was the current editor, I don't know who it was, can't remember, of the Sun. And there was Billy Graham, the evangelist.
The television evangelist from
Yeah,
America.
but Billy Graham, who I'd been to see in the 50s, filling Wembley Stadium, and he'd come to preach to the Queen, apparently, in Windsor. Anyway,
Are you sure this wasn't a dream?
And they had this lunch, and the interesting thing was, Peregrine Worsthorne, who never minced his words, Billy Graham did his thing about his going to have this campaign for God and did grace, and then we sat down there, very grand. So Peregrine Worsthorne laid into Murdoch, saying, "How can you have this evangelist here and be promoting his cause when you have such filth in the News of the World and the Sun?" And Murdoch looked quite chastened by this. I don't think he didn't mount a defence. It's all business.
But your argument, James, was that in the podcast, the idea is that he is kind of quite pro the Page 3 girls, but in your play, it's the opposite, isn't it? That he's a bit funny about it.
Well, yeah. I don't know who's right. Maybe obviously there is such a thing as objective reality. It's one or the other. But
But there's also memory.
But there's memory and there is agenda. No, in my telling, I know this is backed up by some other. Sorry, David. This is backed up by some other people who were there at the time. Their memory of it is that Larry Lamb, the editor, the first editor of the Sun, who eventually had a huge rift with Murdoch, but they sort of built it together. They had the same populist, sensationalist feel for what the news could be in a time when in the 60s it was still quite establishment and quite reverential. It was Larry Lamb's idea, and actually there's a story. I think it might be in the great book. If you're interested in the birth of the Sun, you should read "Stick It Up Your Punter," which is a
Fantastic
great book about the birth of it. In that, it might be in this or in a different book. Larry used to apparently do this thing to Murdoch, where because Murdoch is quite religious and quite superstitious, he would really believe the horoscopes that were printed in his own paper. And so sometimes Larry Lamb might accidentally suggest to the horoscopes writer that there's going to be storms over the Pacific and he shouldn't get on a plane today and come to London on that visit. I think, my memory could be wrong, look it up, is that Murdoch may not have been completely around at that time, and Larry Lamb deliberately engineered it so that he wouldn't be, and that Murdoch was quite shocked. And Murdoch, and maybe I've invented that in my head because I want that to be true. But what is true is I think you're right. I don't think he deliberately, despite the offence he evidently causes a lot of people, I don't think that's his. I don't think he enjoys that. I don't think he sets out to provoke in that way. And when the Sun first launched, and it caused a huge shock, tabloids existed. The Mirror was always quite naughty and cheeky, but the Sun was on a different level.
When the Sun relaunched.
Sorry. It was a broadsheet before.
Yes, a broadsheet that they relaunched in 1969 as this populist tabloid. It received huge attention, as you remember, from the Church of England, from establishment figures, from Fleet Street itself, who thought it was absolute garbage. That wasn't his reason for doing it. I think of him as a disruptor way before the Silicon Valley disruptors that we know and love today. But I don't think he's there to provoke for fun.
There's a kind of argument about audiences. I'm interested in this idea, whether Murdoch has got this amazing instinct for an audience that's out there that's not being served, or whether that audience, that he creates an audience. It's a subtle point, but there is sometimes in the podcast, I think there's an assumption that he's creating an audience, that he's that amazing that he creates it, or that the audience is there. There's a difference, really.
I think I'm fairly clear about that. I think he spotted an unserved audience.
And that's what he does generally.
Well,
I mean, with Fox News, for instance.
He's got this great line that he's anti-establishment. When he came to Britain, he was going to shake up Fleet Street. He did with all the move to Wapping and all that, shake things up, and find an audience that he thinks is being ignored. And ditto with Trump. Yeah. Just go for that audience that feel disaffected and disillusioned with the state of America.
And not catered for.
What?
And not catered for.
Yeah, not catered for. Not catered for in the kind of not nourished really, not nurtured,
loved.
not loved. Yes, I think that's I don't think he turned people into sort of voyeurs by having the page 3 girl in the Sun. He just knew that a lot of men in the 1960s would buy the Sun if they could turn to page 3 and, you know, just have a whatever they had, have a laugh. Well, I mean, you know, I didn't read the Sun. So I think that and the same with the Fox News success. I mean, people tend to forget the Fox News doesn't actually have a very wide circulation. They don't know what their numbers are. I mean, Question Time's audience at the BBC ranks with some of the those Fox and those CNN and people in the States. It's extraordinary. It's not a particularly big audience, but there were all those other people out there. There were the shock jocks. There was Lambert, whatever it was called, Lambert, that man. All those people were feeding, nurturing that feeling of discontent with America. I think Murdoch thought, well, we'll tap into that. In New York, when he got the New York Post, you know, people are a bit mealy-mouthed about New York. It's a very violent place. We'll go for the violence and we'll tell them what it's like, you know. So I don't know. I think he has a good eye for where there's a market that he can fill, and then has the braggadocio or the courage or the money or whatever just to go for it and ignore everybody else. He's not worried about his reputation. He's never wanted to be. He doesn't want to be. Most barons of newspaper in Britain want to be in the House of Lords. You know,
he does not.
Well, he doesn't. All of that's nothing to him.
Yeah.
He despises all that, and he doesn't want to belong to that. He just wants to have I think the feeling of fulfilment of having got to an audience that nobody else had got to.
And what do you think, James? Because in your play, there's a couple of lines that I kind of quite like to quote, because one of them is, this is a quote from Ink. Larry Lamb says it actually, and it says, "Pander to and promote the most base instincts of people all you like, fine, create an appetite, but I warn you, you'll have to keep feeding it." So there's something interesting about that audience, isn't there? If you find that audience and you cater to perhaps their basic instincts, then what happens?
Yeah, I think both things can be true. I agree with David there. I think his skill is to, as a businessman, to find a gap in the market for a product, and not really care about the philosophical questions about that. But then that doesn't mean, I guess, that what you have to deliver to that market doesn't escalate, doesn't become more extreme. And I wonder, certainly if we skip forward to today and the relationship between Fox News and Trump supporters and the feedback loop of it becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy that you legitimize a president because he speaks to an audience, that audience feels served, so Trump serves them, so they feel more justified, and suddenly you're having people
Trump
yelling
bigger and bigger and bigger,
and so suddenly people are screaming and punching each other at rallies. And I do think you can incite and inflame, but I don't think you can create them. I think those feelings are in people and in the fabric of a culture before Murdoch arrives. Yeah.
Okay. Shall we talk about whopping, because this features in the podcast, and it's a very interesting episode. David, at the time, you yourself were in ownership of some newspapers, and I was interested in the idea that obviously Murdoch then does a kind of incredible cloak and dagger operation, moves everything over to Wapping, which is, you know, actually quite exciting to hear about. But he does, in the end, destroy the print unions. And you talk to the printer, who is the person who says that he hopes that Jerry Hall will shag Rupert Murdoch to death. And I was kind of interested in what you felt about it ultimately, whether you felt, despite the fact that you are incredibly respectful to the print workers, that actually Murdoch was right, that this had to happen, because you were a newspaper proprietor yourself.
I don't know whether what word Murdoch was right actually means. I mean, I think what had happened was that almost everywhere in the world, except in Britain, newspapers were now being printed the way they are now on computers. In the Far East, in Africa they were. I mean, I remember trying to buy a printing press, a small printing press, and they couldn't get them in the UK. We had to buy it second-hand from Uganda, where they were going into computerized typesetting. And here in Britain, people were still going through a Caxton process. Yeah. of setting print, on a linotype, putting it into a frame, taking a proof of it. It just went on and on and on. That process could not have gone, and it couldn't last until today. And I think what Murdoch did was to, with absolute ruthless and a sort of focus, decide that the process of change would take too long and would be too innovating, and that the print unions, who were the last. The dock workers had been pretty well destroyed.
Miners.
And miners, yes, but miners was different because that was to do with an industry also shrinking under various governments. But the print workers were. They did have absolute control, as they say in the podcast. If we decide to have a strike, there's no paper, and that's it. Everything, you can't, all the profit's gone, the revenue's gone, the sales gone, and all that. And I think Murdoch thought, if I'm not prepared to spend the next 10 years fighting the trade unions. Everybody who had papers in Fleet Street was fighting the trade unions all the time. The Times and the Telegraph and the Guardian, they were all fighting all the time. And he thought it was just destructive. And then he had this idea, because he'd seen how it worked in Canada and the United States. And the idea was, what amazes me about it, I was talking to James about it, was how the print unions didn't spot what he was doing sooner. They seemed to, here he is, he's flying in computers to Wapping. He's built a fortress.
But he did put them in vans that you couldn't see in.
And he's flying people in to handle them from the United States who go, who stay in Belgravia and not allowed to go out, then brought in limos down to Wapping. And suddenly, whoops, one day, bingo, and he's got the whole bloody thing working and the press is going and everything. They didn't spot it. And that's why they're so angry, I think.
Because they felt duped.
They would just, and what happens? Within a year or two, everybody, of course, has gone on to computer typesetting. The FT went.
But did you feel? Did you kind of applaud that ruthlessness, or did you shudder at it? As a newspaper proprietor yourself, constantly in argument with print unions.
Well, I thought it was like moving from one century to another in one step. So it was horrible for the people who were left behind. And the culture of the print unions was, if you were a proprietor, as I was difficult to deal with, but it was a wonderful culture in its way. They were very close. It was a family business. You got jobs father to son, like television. And they drank together. They went on holiday together. It was the last medieval industry, really. It did not change for 400 years. So to see that go like this, bang, it was sad. On the other hand, it freed up newspapers. The Independent would not have existed without that, that they were able to do it. And now anybody can publish. Well, now it publishes online, but it freed the whole. If you believe in freedom of expression, it was a huge and important victory Murdoch won. But I don't deny that it was horrible for the people who got crushed by it.
Yeah. Shall we talk about the most humble day of my life? Not mine, obviously, but I'll keep that under wraps. So after the hacking scandal, Murdoch eventually ends up in front of the Leveson inquiry. And he says, when he's there, "This is the most humble day of my life," which is kind of an amazing quote to me, because it means nothing at all. Do you not think? When you heard it, as somebody, I'm just going to go to you, James, first, because you're somebody who works with words. When you hear somebody say, "This is the most humble day of my life," he's not really saying anything, is he? Is he saying, "I'm humbled," or "I feel humiliation"? That doesn't really mean anything, does it?
Never really thought about that. Because I have a suspicion sometimes about those inquiries anyway, because they are just theatre.
Very much so, especially when people attack him physically.
Yeah, oh my God. But is it true, you would know this more than I, that James Murdoch didn't know he was going to say it and was genuine? You could almost see it on his face.
He interrupted, didn't he?
Yes,
he sat
James
down at the table and he interrupted. Just before we go any further, I'd just like to say, this is the most humble day of my life.
And he put a little out.
This is a great impression.
That's okay. You're not going to play him in the movie, but it was fine. But he put his hand on James's hand.
And he didn't say humbling.
Yeah.
He said
He didn't
humble.
say humble.
Yeah, that's
what
he,
I
didn't
think,
mean,
yeah.
he didn't mean
Yeah.
I have been brought low. He meant, I mean, it was, what did he mean? In the most humble day of my life? Here am I in front of all you bloody politicians answering questions.
Yeah.
Why the hell should I be here? That would be saying this is the most humble day of my life, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I just think it's an interesting choice of words because he's not saying humbling and he's not
Yes,
saying
it's
I am
true.
humiliated.
I as one of my tricks I do to myself, which I think we should always do when thinking about politics and politicians, I think the lack of empathy towards public figures is sometimes unhelpful. So I think that's why sometimes I quite enjoy subversively taking unsympathetic people and going, what is the most generous version what's the most generous interpretation I can make of this event? And look, I'm not going to pretend that's not quite difficult sometimes with Rupert Murdoch. But in that spirit, given that that is one of the most unforgivable things that a newspaper business has ever done to anybody, there's the interesting bit in the podcast where the guy who broke the story is talking about
Nick Davis.
he'd never seen, and we can believe this or not believe this, he'd never seen Murdoch. He described him as his head in his hands as he was listening to Millie Dowler's family.
I believe that.
Do you believe that?
Yeah. That he went to see Millie Dowler's family.
Right.
And was really, like I say, you know, I think in that way, in private, he would respond. He's a human being. But from the point of view of the humble day of his life, remember he'd had to close a newspaper, and my God, that must have hurt.
Yeah.
Just
Of course.
News of the World gone.
Yeah.
The thing that brought him to Britain,
Yeah, the very first,
gone.
yeah.
Just like that.
It's again an amazingly kind of ruthless decision, isn't it, though, to just go, that's it, it's done.
But that's very Murdoch. Just do it, you know.
Yeah,
Like he
move on.
wouldn't sell me the Times. Just decided, no, not going to have it. Why wouldn't he sell me the Times?
You'll have to have another one of those strange dinners and find
Yes.
out. If you think about there's various stories about Murdoch, and one of the stories that's out there at the moment is it's not about Murdoch, but it's based on an idea of Murdoch, is succession, and that is obviously a lot to do with his children. And I thought what was quite interesting in your podcast, and actually obviously in your play, is that there's not that much mention of the children. You can kind of they are mentioned a little bit in the podcast, but I remember at one point it was quite a big deal. What is going to happen to Murdoch's empire? Is it going to go to Lachlan? Is it going to go to James? What about Elizabeth? Who's closest? And this is not touched in the podcast because it's not really about that, but I do find that quite interesting. What is going to happen, when he goes?
I mean, James may have a better. I mean, I don't know. When we were making the podcast, it was obvious that there's so much material. You had to decide what was really worked. And if you went down the track, like Succession, of his games, if he is playing games with Lachlan and James and Elizabeth, and we only know what comes out publicly. She's moved there, he's moved there, this happened. It would have been a quite different podcast and speculative, whereas because then the three of them won't talk about. The great secret of this podcast is that I have to pay a tribute to my stepson, Joe Sykes, who was actually the producer of this, who inveigled me into doing it, the only person who could have got me to do it. Because he came, he knew I'd just finished doing Question Time, and he said, come and do this. And he and Peggy Sutton together worked on this, and they did all the legwork. He got it to work, and he did it by finding all the people who told the Murdoch story. And that's why I think the podcast is so strong, because all these voices come in and they've been very carefully talk for hours to people and then find the bits that actually made the story work. And had we gone off into that other thing about succession, I mean, that may be another podcast.
Yeah, you could do another one.
Could do another one. But no, so I think that's why.
Yeah. And how did you enjoy making a podcast? Because it is different.
Well, I was going to say, yes. It's
Go on, tell us about it.
What? All right, I'll tell you about it. It's very, very fascinating. I learnt at Joe and Peggy's hands, I learnt an enormous amount about a completely different way of broadcasting. And he was very good. I'd say even a phrase or a sentence, without being an actor on stage, and he'd say, no, that sounds too, you're pushing it too much, just change it a bit. And I now think that podcasting is a kind of, it's first of all a new art. It's completely different from broadcasting. It's different from radio, it's different from television. And in a funny way, actually, the way I'm talking now to you, or the way one talks on television in a studio, is closer to the way podcasts go than radio. Radio now that I've done the podcast, radio seems amazingly mannered to me, and sort of artificial, and as though they're sort of thrusting themselves.
Stiff and
Stiff.
kind of telling you what that's going to happen.
And you know a podcast is being listened to on the train, in the bath, or hurtling down through London on a bike.
Yeah.
And you've got to catch
don't
people's
recommend
ear
that.
whispering. It is, but I mean, as a technique, it's really, really fascinating. I found it engrossing.
Well, I found it interesting to listen to it because you're right, because the experience of it is strangely intimate, because it's there's something still quite public about the radio being on in all the rooms of your house, whereas sat there with just your dulcet tones coming into you, it's like you're talking to me in the bath, if that's not weird. And when the subject matter is about discourse and about the Sun and Fox News, it's almost an antidote to the loud shouting screaminess of the sensationalism of Fox News. I think it's a forum where you can get under the skin of something and wrestle with it in a way that is nuanced and complex and complicated, and all the things actually that often tabloid journalism doesn't do. Tabloid journalism presents things in black and white or red, and there's something about talking about things on this level. It made me miss especially just watching the election at the moment and the retreat into simplicity and talking points and slogans. I think it's the antidote to everything that's wrong with our discourse at the moment.
Yes, that's very true. Shall we talk about that? Because there is an argument perhaps that what Murdoch has done with media, whether that's the Sun, whether that's the News of the World, the idea of hacking, whether that's Fox News, that this has all culminated kind of in the discourse that people have perhaps on social media, or the way that we now talk about things in this kind of massively, you're on this side or you're on this side. There is no discursiveness. It's not allowed. It's just battle drawn. Would you say that is a partly a consequence of the way that Murdoch has run a media empire, that we end up with this kind of discourse?
Not to me, you're saying.
That's to either of you, but I'm going to you, David, because you have hosted Question Time for years and years and years.
Oh dear.
Sorry.
Sorry. Well, a couple of things I'd say. First of all, about Murdoch himself, which I think is pertinent, which is that I don't believe he has a political agenda. He's varied in his life from being pro-Thatcher, then he was pro-Blair, almost stayed with Major, but at the party that didn't happen until we turned out that it did, was persuaded, didn't give Major what he wanted or something, and then went to Blair. I've never spotted a kind of... The thing that most intrigued me about him is that when the referendum on independence in Scotland was just coming, the Sun in England said it was in favour of the Union. The Sun in Scotland didn't say what it was in favour of until about a day before or 2 days before, while they tested the water. So I don't think he has a world view. I mean, obviously, like any tycoon or businessman, he sit down and talk about, what the threat of China is. He'd talk about that. But I don't think he had a kind of political view about how Britain should be, or how... I mean, he was a conservative, a right wing, but I don't think he had a sort of serious view that he could never have become a politician. He could never have been, never have aspired to be Prime Minister. He didn't have that kind of interest. He had kind of vague, rather obvious political views. But in terms of the thing you're asking about, yes, I mean, the Sun certainly upped the ante on roughening the discourse, using crude language. If you're going to make a point, just make it, several times over and go on making it and making it and making it. And I think that is, but long before social media, I think that was certainly one of the effects he had. In New York, with Fox News, it's obvious because, they have one or two people, don't they, who occasionally come in to sort of suggest that maybe they're more balanced. But basically, they just thump away at stuff. Yeah. So, yes, I think it has. I hate what's happening at the moment in terms of social media in this country. I think this election is the most vile election that I've ever seen, and I've seen them since 19-something or other. I just hate the way it's going. I hate the amount of hatred and, disillusion that's about. I think it's the most appalling spectacle. And we did, you mentioned question time, and we did see it ever since there was that fateful decision to have a referendum on our membership of Europe. This heightened thing that it like a magnet drawing all kinds of iron filings to it. Hatred of this, hatred of that, in a way on both sides actually of the debate. It's just horrible.
It is. What would you say, James, to the
idea? I couldn't agree more. It's just very ugly, and whether that ugliness, we do in the play. We talked a lot about how they, as a necessity, they because they didn't have any money, they didn't have any time when they were first building that first sun. They had to embrace ugliness as a style because they couldn't make it slick and glossy. So it looked different to other newspapers, and it was the fonts were bigger, and it is more italicized, and the columns weren't as justified, and in that way it was attractive to people. Beyond the style, yes, the language and the tone of it, and of course you have to also accept that sometimes that can be important. To be punchy and to be anti-establishment, it can and has been very important throughout history. But I would agree. I think the balls that were set rolling in terms of populism and rudeness and aggressiveness and divisiveness that began upon that arrival, famously, and it has now literally resulted in a president being in the White House who has been designed by this news organisation.
I can't ever get out of my mind that headline when the Belgrano was sunk. And the argument over whether it was legitimate to sink the Belgrano is quite another matter. But the Sun headline, after 100, 200 people had been drowned, "Gotcha." Do you remember that? Yeah. Gotcha. And I thought that sort of typifies them.
It does. Hello, audience. Hi. This is your turn. So I have in here some questions, I'm hoping, from you. Oh, look at this. Hang on. Let me get it straight. Yes, I have questions on... Slido. Oh, yes, I've got loads of questions. This is brilliant. It's like magic. Thank you very much. Okay. So I'm going to read some of these questions. You can wave at us if you feel like you want to wave at us to say that you're asking the question. This one's from William Warren. Do you want to wave? William, are you here? Hello. No. Oh, look, David, you can point at the back and say, the gentleman at the back. Okay, so I'm going to say, you've just mentioned a headline that you did not like. Do you have a favourite Sun headline?
Do I have a favourite Sun headline? Do you? I don't. No, I don't.
Not stick it up your junta?
Hi there. No, I think the gotcha one certainly wasn't a favourite, but it was definitely very interesting, particularly what the Private Eye did with it afterwards, when the phone hacking scandal happened. And they had gotcha. And
gotcha on, yes.
All the figures on there.
Hoist with your own petard.
Yeah.
Freddie Starr ate my hamster, is that?
Freddie Starr ate my hamster. Yes, that is a good one.
That's not. Is that the Sun?
That's.
I don't think that's the Sun.
That's not the Sun. That's News of the World.
Yeah. The Star.
Was that the News of the World? Or
no, I think that's News of the World.
I think it might be in the Star.
I've got mine. Have
you got yours? You've just looked it up.
I wasn't just bored. I was looking something up. I think I mentioned this to you one. I think this is the right one. It was a sports headline. You probably know what it is. Yes, I think Caledonian were playing Celtic, and I don't remember what the result was, but the headline was "Super Cali Go Ballistic Celtic were atrocious." Yeah.
So good.
And you just take the rest of the week off after that.
Yeah,
wouldn't you?
you so would. You
Absolutely
so would. Okay, this one is from Anonymous, so don't put your hand up. David, what is the most revealing Murdoch anecdote you've heard that you couldn't include in the series?
But this is a podcast.
Yeah. They can always edit it out. Tell us now.
Joe, can you think of a revealing anecdote? What?
Oh, look, you're hiding now. Look, we can see you.
I can't think of an anecdote that we didn't put in. No, because we put everything in. I mean, we put in I hope she shags him to death. We put in, he's a fucking idiot. You know, we didn't leave anything out. We didn't find out anything about Murdoch that Audible or Amazon thought, oh, better not say that about Murdoch because he's such a very important person. Everything we did went through. I think this thing was lawyered, obviously. For
Really?
some time,
Yes.
wasn't it? Yes.
Yes, how long did that take?
I don't know. I wasn't party to the lawyering, but there was some lawyering. Was there much cut out, Peggy? No. No, nothing was cut out, no.
Okay, it was beautifully made.
Yeah.
Have you got any extra anecdotes? You put it all in, didn't you? Okay, so look.
Yeah, we put it all in.
That's good. All right, okay, James, this is a question for you. So in the play, you cover the early period of The Sun in ink. Would the phone hacking scandal be a strong theatrical follow-up for you? And what angle would you take? This is from Richard.
Yeah, that is a good question. There's always a question about when to do these stories. How long is long enough from something that's either traumatic nationally or traumatic for real-life people involved who maybe don't want to be in the public eye? I don't know, in the way personally for me, the reason why I did an origin story, why I tackled that first year and the birth of it, is because in a way that was the story about all the things that followed anyway. How they plugged into how they created the DNA of tabloid news felt like. I always thought of it like the Star Wars prequels, which I know are not everyone's favourite films, but it's like watching. It's like watching Anakin Skywalker. You know he's going to become Darth Vader and build the Death Star, but at that moment in time, he's young and curious and has doubts and anxieties and uncertainties, and it's quite, sometimes it's quite humanising, and sometimes it's even quite endearing to watch somebody being radical and carefree and cavalier, even though you know what the consequences are. So no, I personally wouldn't, because I feel like I've already done it, but I'm sure there would be a tasteful way and an important way. I've always believed that. Story, drama, film, television is not just confection, it's not just entertainment, it actually is a different way in to difficult subject matters alongside journalism. So I very much endorse somebody taking that on and trying to do that humanely and empathetically.
Yeah, okay.
And also, I guess, sorry, I just realised if I was going to do it, the question would be why, like what happens. It wouldn't be the logistics or the big personalities, it would be what has to happen in a culture, including our own. And our own culpability as citizens, what has to go wrong, what has to malfunction
in order for that to happen.
In order for that to become a normal practice that people didn't even question.
Yeah, which it definitely was. Okay, this is from Harriet. Do you think that Rupert Murdoch will listen to this podcast? Have you like sent it? Have you sent a little note to him with a subscription to Audible?
I don't think he. No, I don't think he gives a damn. I don't think he cares what anybody thinks about him. I think that's part of his strength. I think that's why he's been able to defy, everybody from the print unions here, the television industry in America. He just doesn't give a damn. He does what he wants. And he doesn't seek anything. Doesn't seek respect, doesn't seek honours, doesn't seek to be a little bit being with the powerful, but only if they serve his purpose. Like the guy at the very beginning of this podcast who was headed, Trump actually rang him up. I think we didn't have this in. It's really reading. Maybe it's not true. Maybe it's a libel. But anyway, I'll say it all.
It's all right. They'll edit it out.
Yeah, they're cutting.
Don't worry.
Trump rang up Murdoch and said, "Who would you like to see on the FCC, whatever it's called, FCO, FCC, anyway, the Federal Communications Commission." This is crazy. This is like ringing up, the head of ITV and saying, who would you like to see on the body that's regulating you?
Yeah.
You tell us who you'd like him and put him on.
Who's your chum?
I think that he does. That's what he likes about power. He likes people who do things for him and get him free up the regulations so that he can do things the way he wants.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's vain. Funnily, at all vain. He doesn't look like he looks. I mean, when you meet him, he's a kind of shambling old figure, but he's clearly.
He moves fast though. I've seen him move. I've been sat in a
We're trying to catch him.
In reception, yeah, and he came through like a rocket,
Oh, yeah.
like with people in his way. And this was only like a couple of years ago when he was quite old.
Really?
He was like shoo, like that. Yeah, I was impressed.
That was before he married Jerry Hall.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, James, did you get any reaction to ink from Murdoch or anyone involved?
Yes, hi Rupert, thanks for listening. We did, and actually to David's point, we knew there would be a lot of I think it's the first time anyone had put him on stage, and there was a nervousness about that. And we thought he would come quite quickly, but he didn't. He sort of he sent his lieutenants, and I think most people from the Sun and things came. And I think it was about the third to last night of the run he eventually turned up. We heard it's because there was one particularly shocking, traumatic event that we depicted in it that was all true about that first few months of the Sun, which was the kidnap and murder of his chairman's wife, and they were trying to kidnap and kill his first wife Anna. And I think we heard that he didn't necessarily want to or need to relive that, but he eventually came, and he was generous with his time. He met the company and asked a few questions. I didn't really get much from him apart from that, but it didn't strike me as vain. He wasn't bothered about the act playing him. The only thing I remember him talking about, I wanted to ask you about this, in terms of his the destruction, basically, of Fleet Street, that community and that culture, and moving his papers to Wapping. There's also that contradiction in that he is very, very romantic as a newsman. He's very romantic about the press, and we had a sequence in the play where we showed hot metal printing, and it looks like something out of Lord of the Rings. People are bashing things with hammers and steel, and this smoke and hissing and lava and fire. He talked about that sequence the most, actually. And you could tell that it was a passion of his. And yet,
that's so weird. He destroyed it.
And then when the pragmatist kicked in and went, "Oh, I really love this, but I'm going to kill it because it doesn't advance what I need of my business."
But, I mean,
how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I had to reconcile them myself. What happened? The process of printing was, without a doubt, the most exciting, exhilarating, glamorous business. The deadline approaching, in my case, at the end of a week. In his case, night after night after night, and the sound and fury of it, and the skills that were involved. These different, every skill had a different union representing it, but the skills that were involved in, for instance, typing the letters in on these bits of lead that came out as slugs of lead like that, putting those into a plate, locking that up, checking that the shape, all the complicated things of print that have got lost with computers, like balancing things perfectly, shaping the page so it looks good, changing things at the last moment, all that. Anybody who was involved in newspapers loved that, but what they also knew was that the thing was actually gradually sinking under the weight of this. The key to it in this country was that after the Second World War, newsprint, actual paper you printed on, was rationed. So you got paper depending upon how much you'd had the previous year. Right. So you couldn't expand. One of the techniques that newspaper proprietors used was to keep out competition, was to keep getting this newsprint and then make sure that they always got the papers out because it was so valuable. The advertising was valuable, the sales were valuable. The way to do that, you secured your newsprint. The next thing you have to do is to secure your labor force. So they got in the habit of always paying whenever there was a demand for wages, always paying. And that went on for 10, 20 years and had the great effect of keeping competition out because nobody could afford to start up a newspaper in Fleet Street. But it was destroying the freedom of journalism because it meant people couldn't start other papers. Yeah. You couldn't do it. You couldn't afford it. And I think, and also it was very, very, very expensive. I'm sure Murdoch released billions by going to Wapping, but it was the way the world was going, I think. And you can have the love of the thing you kill. Every man kills the thing he loves.
And it was print.
Isn't that the quote?
I may weep.
How does it go on? The coward does it with a kiss. The brave man does it with a sword. The coward does it with a kiss.
I've never heard the second half of that.
Yeah, you did it with the sword. Okay, there's no snogging there, was there? Okay, so this is another anonymous question. Do you think we give him too much kudos? Is the kind of hate aimed at him misplaced? Should it be aimed at his main team instead? So I understand that really. So the idea is that, you've made a whole podcast essentially about Rupert Murdoch, but of course there's loads and loads of other people involved. It's the same thing with the play. If we see him as a figurehead, are we giving him too much power?
What do you think? I think no.
I don't think so either.
No.
Wrong.
I think that if you hate Murdoch and if you hate his politics and if you hate what you think he's done to political discourse, then you must go on hating him, and he must be in your sights all the time as the enemy, because he's created it. It's interesting, the people who leave him. It's rather like the people who leave the Conservative Party now and go Liberal Democrat. You can tell they no longer sign up to what's on offer. And with Murdoch, people sort of fell off, and felt he'd gone too far, felt he was got it wrong, and left. The people who stayed sign up. I mean, they know what they're doing.
Yeah, they're never going to change.
But it's Murdoch that leads it, still leads it.
I have to just say, this isn't a question.
Does he run Fox still?
Yeah.
Does he run Fox still? He does, isn't he?
I just have to say, this is not a question, but it's just a comment. Nikolai says, sounds like you both fell in love with him a bit. Did you?
Every man kills the thing.
So the answer is...
No.
Oh, look, that's very defensive. No, I didn't.
No, I don't know where it went, all squeaky. No, I did. Well, I mean, you have to... No, I think the difference is... I really do think the difference is empathy, but that doesn't mean sympathy. It doesn't mean agreeing with. I just don't know how to write anybody if you don't at least perform the exercise where you go, well, what do they want? What are they struggling with? What do they think that's good? And I can disagree with some of those, but it's the only way to write it. It's the only way for an actor to act it, is if they can imbue them with some sort of humanity, and he is a human being. No, I don't think I did, but people might disagree.
Flatly no. Okay, fine. What about, this is another anonymous one, you're all very shy. How do you feel about Liverpool boycotting the Sun? It says, how does he feel, Murdoch feel about Liverpool boycotting the Sun? Any guilt? This is obviously about Hillsborough under Kelvin Mackenzie's editorship. The Sun went in completely appallingly with the victims of the Hillsborough tragedy, and most people in Liverpool will never buy the Sun again. Do we know how Murdoch feels about this?
I don't know. I can make an assumption.
What was your assumption?
My assumption would be that he would shrug his shoulders and say, well, that's, he'd probably think it was a mistake. I don't think Kelvin Mackenzie thinks it's a mistake. I think he'd think it was a mistake, but I think he wouldn't. I don't think he'd say sorry to Liverpool.
Yes, that's a
Has he said sorry to Liverpool?
Murdoch? No.
I don't think so.
No. Okay, another question. This is from Charlie. Charlie, do you want to wave? Are you here? Hey, I just like to see people. Hello. Hi, Charlie. How do we make people care about partisan and manipulative monopolies over the information we consume? Because right now people seem apathetic. That is quite interesting.
Yes. How do you make people care? Because you think people are apathetic during this election at this time, you're saying? Yes?
I'm talking about just the last few years when the same story can be reported in so many different ways so that it doesn't resemble the truth at all by the end of it. But people still buy The Sun, people still watch Fox News. I know you talked about the limited circulation of it, but if people are constantly told that the news you're receiving it's not true in a lot of cases.
Are you trying to use the words fake news?
I'm trying not to.
But it's like the way social media is working in this election, isn't it? This constant repetition of a view, which if you agree with it, you only get that view put to you. Is that what you're suggesting?
I mean, also, would you not say that there are, in the end, people believe that because people believe in fake news, that people believe that all news is manipulated or not manipulated, so they stop believing in the BBC?
Well, they say that. I don't know what the evidence for that is. Is there evidence for that? I mean, people say, yes, that everybody treats everything as fake news, but I don't actually detect that. I mean, I was making a film about Brexit through October, and it didn't seem to me that people had very, clear views, made up their mind about things. They weren't sort of quoting back things they'd had on social media or things they'd had from newspapers. They seemed to me, perfectly capable of making up their own minds. And I mean, there's obviously there's a strand, isn't there, of not just necessarily hate, but of sort of virulent opinion where you just believe everything is that you've heard is a lie, and what you know to be true is true, and there's no room for somebody like James coming along and sifting opinion.
What's unique about that is that you're seeing people on the left as well as the right having that approach to media at the moment.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to watch the left also become suspicious of the BBC as well, and they have my huge sympathy. You shouldn't take your Twitter feed as the national frame in which the event should be viewed, but it's amazing how on the same day or in the same hour people could be saying, I can't believe how pro-Brexit the BBC is, and I can't believe how pro-Remain the BBC is, and I can't believe they didn't cover this, whilst clicking to a link where the BBC covered it. I do think, I feel like there's a disconnect between people's romance of newspapers, which and other films and plays will exploit. People love films about investigative journalists, whether it's, what was the Tom Hanks one with Meryl Streep recently? The Post, or Spotlight, or My Play, or I think we have an idea in journalists, our head of a journalist is being honourable, and yet there's a disconnect where people distrust news at the moment. I think it's the only other thing that Murdoch talked to me about when he came to see the play, apart from the printing press scene, was about Facebook. He was just talking about the loss of control of the mechanisms and the platforms for which he can distribute news. But ironically, I do think personalised news feeds is the logical endpoint to everything that Rupert Murdoch created in 1969 with the rebranding of the Sun. The mantra when he was doing it was give people what they want, and let people write in and we'll publish their letters and they can tell us what they want. So 50 years later, when algorithms are delivering you exactly that, more than any journalist could ever have imagined, I do think he is the victim of the success of that.
And how is that going to be reversed?
Regulation. It has to be regulation. I think we are still the internet is still really new, and we're still in the Wild West phase of all this stuff, particularly social media. That's less than 10 years old, or just about 15 years old, and it's just it's like cars where there are no lanes and there are no seatbelts. Eventually, people went, do you know what? I think we should have lanes, and everyone.
We should possibly not all be drunk when we drive.
Well, exactly. So I think we need lanes and we need seatbelts, and it needs regulating, which obviously Murdoch is the antithesis to his libertarian politics. But something, and we have to take responsibility as well. Every time we share something we haven't checked, every time we block or cancel or shout at somebody for disagreeing with it and assuming that's because their position is immoral rather than just that their life experience has led them to a different place, I think we have to be responsible for being a bit kinder.
We do. Okay. So look, there's a light down here that's kind of flashing at me. So I'm going to give you one more question. And then I think we're going to wrap it up. They don't like it if you carry on. It is, what do you think the next decade of the Murdoch empire looks like? Possibly he will die. No?
Possibly he will die. How old is he now?
88? 80? No, that's a bit older.
Well, he will die anyway. We know that at some point.
Yeah.
Possibly
in the next decade.
Yes, possibly in the next decade. I don't know.
Come on, David, you must know.
Well, I haven't the slightest clue what will happen. I mean, I'm watching Suppression.
No, it was that's The Sopranos. The Sopranos meet Succession.
I'm watching Succession, and I don't know what's going to happen in Succession. I have no idea. I mean, I agree with James that what's needed is much better. I mean, you do have to have regulation. It's just, both of television in the States. BBC here is very heavily regulated. We fight a battle to persuade people that we are genuinely attempting to be impartial. and that's an ongoing battle, and that will go on. And I would like to see that there's room for. I don't think it's right actually to have a news service that is entirely bigoted and biased, and I don't think it's right to have Fox News. And the idea that you can equate Fox News with CNN or CBS or NBC or ABC is just nonsense. It's just not true. They are liars. They are liars who deliberately distort the truth. ABC, NBC, and that's the liberal establishment. We've got a whole thing on this in the podcast. That's the liberal establishment. You can't trust them. You can actually trust them. They may get some things wrong, but they're not there deliberately trying to change public opinion and distort people's views. And that's what Fox is doing. And for that, I think Murdoch is responsible. But whether that will go away, because America, after all, are very keen on total freedom, and they began the shock jock thing. They began having liars telling falsehoods on radio to stir up their readers, to get more advertising in. That was the United States. We didn't have that here. We've got a shimmer of it here now. I won't mention any names, but there are some broadcasters who sort of a bit going that way, not on the BBC.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. James, do you have any idea what the next decade of the Murdoch Empire looks like that you could write about?
No, not really. I think it feels unsustainable. The mood, the toxicity in the mood, and I think something will have to reverse that or puncture that bubble. The other thing I would say is that I remember from the moment when he banged his fist on that parliamentary table and said, "This is the most humble day of my life." To the how many elections have we had? The 2017 election, when it was first perceived that the populists didn't quite go in the direction that his papers suggested that they should, and Corbyn had a bigger turnout than everyone imagined, and the Conservative Party lost their majority. I think people were predicting the loss or the waning of his influence, and I think that couldn't be more untrue and false. I think he's at the peak, as you talk about in the podcast. He's at the peak of his influence. This is the height of that experiment that began 50 years ago. And he has a man in the White House, and you talk about it so well in the podcast, the strange relationship between Fox News calling the president calling Fox News. No one quite knows who's planting the ideas or the language or the words. It's this strange unreality, this strange fiction. A fictional character is the president of the United States, and he has been written to a lesser or greater extent by Murdoch and the people around him. So I don't think his influence is waning. I think it's still going.
There's a one little great anecdote about Fox News and Trump, which was that when they were talking about Trump when he'd become president, and whoever was presenting Fox News says, the president listens, which is true, listens to us every morning. He listens to us first 2 hours, which he does, and sort of and sends out tweets about it. He said, "I tell you how we can prove it. We'll say, Mr. President, will you turn the lights in the White House off?" And the lights in the White House behind them went off. And they said, "See? You see? He's listening." Of course, it was CGI. It was completely fake.
Gosh,
but it absolutely summarised the sort of way that he...
It is. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for being a fantastic audience and for sending those questions in. And thank you, of course, to James and David.